Good evening. Can you guys see that?
Yep, we can see.
Fabulous. So what I'm going to do tonight is two things. I'm going to present the findings of the national study of Jewish grandparents and talk about its implications. And then if we have a little bit of time, I will talk about another resource that we have available for organizations around the country. So I'll just get started. Let's see if I can make this work. No, I can't. There you go. So Jewish Grandparents Network is really the only organization in the country whose sole purpose is to engage and support grandparents as they embrace their both traditional roles and new roles in their families. And we do that through research, network building, advocacy, institutional partnerships, and innovative new initiatives that we've begun to develop. And we'll talk about that in a minute. In order to get things moving for our organization, we did the first national study of Jewish grandparents. And that was done about 3 years ago in December 2018. We had a national representative sample of about 1,000, which is randomly chosen, and an outreach sample of about 6,800 folks who chose to self-identify. It was really the national representative sample that's meaningful because it's a random sample and it gives you an accurate picture of grandparents across the United States. So before we do that, just a couple of things we do know. We know from multiple studies, one at Boston College and one at University of Oxford, that grandparents are good for grandkids. That the University of Oxford showed that children who have a high level of engagement with their grandparents had fewer emotional and behavioral problems. And Boston College study showed pretty much the same thing, that adult children who had strong relationships with their grandparents had reduced depressive symptoms. Marshall Duke, faculty at Emory University and researcher, showed that children who know their family stories are more emotionally resilient and feel more in control of their lives. And it is, in fact, the grandparents who are sharing those stories. Grandkids are good for grandparents based on the 2018 study of AARP, that grandparents agree that having grandchildren has a positive impact on mental health, and grandchildren also make grandparents more social and physically active. And I can tell you that that's true from my perspective. We also know from research in the Jewish community that grandparents strengthen the Jewish identity of their grandkids. And that's from two different researchers, one at Kosman and Kazar, one from the Cohen Center. One studied children of intermarriage, the other studied birthright participants, and demonstrated that college students who went to synagogue and other Jewish settings with their grandkids were most likely to feel a strong attachment to the Jewish people. Jack Wertheimer says that grandparents are American Jewry's great untapped resource. So just really some background on the study. It was about a 20-minute study, mobile friendly, it was online. We surveyed grandparents ages 55 to 80. They self-identified as Jewish. We didn't ask for proof. They had to be residents of the United States, and they had to have at least one grandchild under 18 years old in the US. We wanted to know about family demographics, attitudes, beliefs, needs, behaviors, and aspirations. What we did is we chose to do a deep dive in terms of the relationship between the grandparent and one grandchild. That grandchild was chosen randomly. We couldn't ask a grandparent to respond, let's say, to their relationships with 8 different grandkids because that would take too long, and we couldn't let them choose their favorite because we wouldn't get accurate data. So just real quickly, here's some of the things we learned. The average age of our grandparents were kind of ranged between 65 and 74. You see the breakdown in terms of religious denomination. About half will reform, about 30% conservative, 5% Orthodox, and 10% no denomination. One of the things that's important to note is that while all the grandparents self-identified as Jewish, 22% had a spouse or partner who did not identify as Jewish. So 1 out of every 5 grandparents reported to have a spouse or partner who was not Jewish. About 80% were currently married and living with a partner, 10% were widowed, and about 11% were either divorced or separated. The important data here that I want to show you is just the chart on the far right, which shows that about a little less than half of grandparents live an hour away or less from their grandkids by car, bus, or train. However, about 40%, so 4 out of 10, grandparents live 5 hours or more by car, train, or bus from their grandkids. So that's a really important figure to think about in terms of how we think about programming for grandparents and their grandkids. In terms of the faith or how grandkids are being raised, more than half, 53% of grandparents report that at least one of their grandkids is being raised in an interfaith household, or they have at least one non-Jewish parent. And we see on the right how those children are being raised. 15% Jewish only, 23% Jewish and another faith. That makes 38%. That's about what, a little more than 1/3. 30% at no faith and 20% in another faith only. That's almost half. So that gives you a sense of not only the rate of intermarriage, but a sense of how these grandkids are being raised. What we do know across the board among all grandparents, that it's very important for them, for their grandkids to connect to Jewish community, values, and traditions. So 71% report that it's important for them to transmit Jewish values. 70% say it's important for me to teach my grandchild about Jewish heritage. 64 and 63% said I want my grandkid to have a strong connection to Judaism and want my grandkids interested in doing Jewish activities. Conversely, and interestingly, only 38% say it is important for me that my grandchild marries a Jewish partner. That may be reflective of the reality of life today, that grandparents see what's happening in the world around them. In terms of the kind of things that grandparents and their grandkids do together, it's important to note that by and large, grandparents and grandkids do far more secular activities than they do Jewish activities. And I think it's important to think about how we may want to use that data to engage grandparents and grandkids together. Importantly, we think that the really important piece of data here is that 75% of grandparents report that they do stuff, games, hiking, whatever, watching TV in their grandchild's home, and 65% said that they did stuff in their home. So we believe that in many ways, home is where it's at in terms of figuring out how to connect with grandchild and grandkids. Conversely, we see that only a quarter said that they attended synagogue services with their grandkids or other activities. We think that cooking and baking Jewish food is a good thing to do together, but only 1 out of 5 say they cook with their grandkids, and 1 in every 5 read a Jewish book. And the numbers get much lower when you look at program attendance at JCCs and other activities as well. So one of the things we encourage people to think about is how to create opportunities for grandparents and grandkids in secular or in non-Jewish settings and in the home, which we think is a really essential opportunity. So I want to talk very briefly about the 5 different segments of grandparents that we identified. We did what's called a segmentation analysis, where we took 31 questions, and we, based on those questions, came up with archetypes or different types of grandparents based on their aspirations, their activities, and those kind of things. And we came up with 5 different types of grandparents, or segments of the grandparent community. And those segments are joyful, faithful, joyful at 20%, faithful at 16%, secular at 23%, wistful at 20%, and detached at 21%. And I'm going to go through definitions of these very, very quickly. All of this data, by the way, is available on our website, and we'll share that resource with you at some point in the future. So joyful is 1 out of 5 grandparents. These grandparents love being grandparents. They feel it is important to transmit Jewish values. They model those behaviors in terms of, let's say, going to synagogues and things like that. So I would consider myself a joyful grandparent. I love being a grandparent. I do Jewish things with my grandkids. And that's about 1 out of every 5 grandparents. The other group that's similar to that is called faithful grandparents, which are like joyful, but they're more intentional in their aspirations for their grandkids to be engaged in Jewish life, and they more intentionally model Jewish behaviors. So they have the highest percentage of synagogue goers. They're deeply committed to their grandkids doing Jewish things on an ongoing basis, and they're very supportive and involved in their grandkids having a strong connection to Judaism and married Jews. So they're like faithful, but a little like joyful, but they tick up. That doesn't necessarily mean that these folks are all Orthodox. These folks are broken down among all the denominations. Secular grandparents is a term we chose not because they don't believe in God, but because they're really not really engaged in promoting Jewish identity in their grandkids. So they're not modeling Jewish behaviors. They're not engaged by and large in religious life. 1 out of 5 is a synagogue goers, and 2/3 of their children have chosen partners who are not Jewish. So these are folks who love being grandparents, but by and large are not engaged in promoting the Jewish identity of their grandkids in active ways and by modeling those behaviors. Wistful grandparents, 1 out of every 5 grandparents speaks about having difficulties in the intergenerational dynamics that get in the way of their relationship with their grandkids. So they're significantly less likely to have interacted with their grandkids. Their ideas about child rearing might differ from those of their adult children, and they don't feel valued. And we hear stories that are kind of range from sad to horrible. Parents who will not allow their grandparents to see their grandkids. That's 1 out of every 5 grandparents. And the final group is detached grandparents. They're really not engaged Jewishly and not really engaged in passing on their beliefs. They're not, they're really not engaged Jewish in many ways. Many of these folks are a bit older, and some of them also have health-related issues that gets in the way of their relationship with their grandkids. So, when we draw the concentric circles about how we want to think about engaging different grandparents, this group would be kind of on the outside of those concentric circles. So based on this data, we came up with a number of different kind of ways of looking at our community. The one thing we did want to do is, I mentioned we had 2 different sample groups. One was the outreach sample, and those are folks who self-identify to be involved in the survey, and the other is the representative sample, which is a random sample engaged by a random sample organization. So you'll see on the bottom, when we look at the outreach sample, 75% are either joyful or faithful. And we say to ourselves, great, 3, 4, these are all those folks who are involved in our organization. But when we look at the representative sample, that group is only 36%. So I think it's probably fair to say that by and large, our Jewish organizations are only engaging about 1/3 of grandparents and their grandkids. Moving on. So here are some of the things that grandparents are involved in themselves. And I think this is interesting. And we're going to come back to this kind of synagogue minion chart in a minute. But you see that, you see how grandparents are modeling Jewish behaviors. Here are the joyful and here are the faithful. And by and large, they tend to be members of synagogues or minyanim, how that number drops with secular, even further with detached, but it's up to 40% close for the wistful group. But again, these are the folks who have difficulty in multi-generational relationships. Interestingly enough, membership in synagogues among grandparents is much higher than membership in JCCs. And you see the numbers here. Across the board, it's about 9% of grandparents say that they're involved in a JCC. Only 70% are involved in adult Jewish learning. And I want you to remember these figures when it comes to synagogue and participation in minyanim. So we asked grandparents in the past year, how often have you and your grandchildren done these things together? And here we have celebrated Shabbat. Well, Shabbat is really the jewel of our Jewish tradition, and it is an opportunity to have meaningful interactions. Well, across the board, in the total population, about 70% said they have not celebrated Shabbat with their grandkids in the past year. Among the joyful, that number is like 49%. Report that they have not engaged or connected around Shabbat with their grandkids in the past year. And about 40%, they do say they do it less a month. So this is pretty striking that by and large, grandparents are not, doing Shabbat together with their grandkids. And we see this as a profound opportunity, that Shabbat really can provide extraordinarily meaningful opportunities for grandparents and grandkids. We have to figure out a way to engage them in a way that's going to be meaningful for them. And again, if you go across the board, among the secular, you'll see over 80% of grandparents said they haven't done anything at all on Shabbat with their grandkids, and among the detached, it's over 90%. So somehow we have to rethink how we connect grandkids and grandparents in families in Shabbat, either at home or in synagogue or otherwise. Speaking of the synagogue, we see that even though that grandparents, especially the joyful and faithful, tend to be members of synagogues, they're by and large not going to synagogues with their grandkids. So among the total percentage, I want to say about 77% report that they have not attended a service at a synagogue or a temple with their grandkid in the last year. Even among the joyful, it's close to 60% have not attended synagogue or services with their grandkids in the past year. In the faithful, it's closer to 40%. And again, when we look at both the secular and detached, we see how those numbers really go through the roof. And this speaks of any activity at a synagogue or a temple. And you see that among the total group, close to 80% said that they have not engaged in any other activity at a temple or a synagogue in the past year. And so we believe that while grandparents may be connected personally with synagogues, collectively, we need to figure out a way to do a better job of engaging grandparents and their grandkids in synagogue life and in Shabbat activities. Just a couple more slides and then I think we'll be done. So you see that, where do grandparents and grandkids do things together? Birthdays are a big event. And the other thing I want to, and we said doing stuff at their home and our homes, they read together. Interestingly enough, on the far right, we see that about 35 or 36% of grandparents are providing childcare for their grandkids on a needed or scheduled basis. Now, among grandparents who live within an hour of their grandkids by car, bus, or train, that number is closer to 50%. So grandparents continue to provide a central role in the daily lives of their adult children and their families. In terms of the kind of Jewish things we do together, Hanukkah is very, very active. National holidays like Thanksgiving are wonderful opportunities. And you see in terms of celebrating Pesach, how the 5 different groups kind of define themselves, with probably about 70% of joyful and probably 80% of faithful celebrating Pesach with their grandkids. That number drops precipitously when you go to secular. It's about 40% and about 16% for the detached. Interestingly enough, by and large, grandparents and grandkids don't do high holiday services with their grandkids, which, makes us think about how we can rethink high holidays in a way that will engage grandparents and grandkids in a more meaningful way. Something like Tashlich is a wonderful opportunity. So we'll move on. So I want to show you the 2 sides of this slide that I think are profoundly interesting. So look how high the numbers are here when we ask grandparents what they aspire to teach their grandkids. What they really want to aspire, they aspire to teach their grandkids to lead ethical and moral lives. But if we look at the far right, it doesn't really translate into Jewish activities. So donating to Tzedakah, the numbers are much lower. Here, the average is about 82%, and here the average is about 41%, so about half. So there's a disconnect between this notion of leading an ethical and moral life and donating to charity. The numbers to volunteering to make the world a better place, Tikkun Olam, are also much lower, but not as profoundly different as donating to Tzedakah, engaging in Tzedakah. So what does this mean? So, and again, all of this is available on our website. When we think about how we engage grandparents in Jewish life, the joyful and faithful are folks who we currently connect with. And we can continue to engage them in synagogues and JCCs. And one of the things we strongly encourage is to figure out ways to bridge institutional life and home-based experiences. For the secular Jews, we have to be more kind of open and think about how we could connect secular activities, let's say like Thanksgiving, going to the park, birthday parties, and how we can kind of link them to Jewish values. We need to be more sensitive and engaging of today's diverse Jewish community. And we have to rethink the spaces in which we engage grandparents and their families. And so a park, whatever it is, becomes an opportunity to create a meaningful Jewish experience. In terms of the wistful, it's 1 out of every 5. I think this is a group that needs help. And so I think we need to think about how we could provide them support in terms of navigating complex family dynamics, perhaps provide additional technology resources to make them to connect, and also to explore surrogate grandparent opportunities for grandparents who may not be able to see their own grandkids or may not have grandkids. So one of the things we think a lot about is the importance of creating local-based support groups. As I mentioned, so here's some things to think about. Grandparents are an incredible resource for our Jewish community, and how do we engage them in partners in promoting and advancing and supporting Jewish life? I think synagogues and community organizations need to think creatively of how to engage multi-generational families, interfaith families, and multiracial families. I think when synagogues leaders think about elevating their work or promoting their work, I think they need to engage grandparents in figuring that out. And to think about what resources would be required to better engage grandparents. So finally, as I mentioned, this entire study is available on our website for downloading. And additionally, there's very, very significant additional material that is available as well. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to find one other site, and then we'll just continue. So talk among yourself.
Thank you so much.
All right, so there's one other site I want to show you, and then I'll be done. I wanted to make members of the community aware of this resource that we currently have, and it is free and available to any organization or individual. This is our website, and on our website, we have something we call the Family Room, which provides 75 different activities for grandparents and family members in 8 different categories. So for instance, in family stories, we have activities for learning to write a forever letter, how to make family portraits with your family. This is one, we have actually a webinar, a presentation from a storyteller about how to tell stories in their own way. And so again, we have about 75 different resources for activities for grandparents and grandkids to do together. And these are also activities that can be done in a preschool, in an after school, or in other kinds of synagogue activities. So here's a nice opportunity for taking a hike on Shabbat afternoon with your family members. So my name is David Raphael. My email address is david@jewishgrandparentsnetwork.org, and I'm happy to be helpful or supportive in any way I can.
David, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Do we know from that study how many observe Shabbat?
How many grandparents observe Shabbat by themselves with their families?
Yeah, I mean, because you said that 77% have not attended services with a grandchild in the past year. And I believe there was
Well, we have the data on, we mean, we may have data on grandparents' participation in Shabbat offhand. I don't remember it offhand.
Mhm.
What I do have is data on how often grandparents and grandkids are celebrating Shabbat together.
Right, because if your sample does not celebrate Shabbat themselves, then they would not be celebrating Shabbat with their grandchildren. And I'm also wondering if what was very interesting was that you mentioned how far the grandparents live from their grandchildren.
Mhm.
And so you have within 1 hour, 2 to 5 hours, over 5 hours away.
Right.
And so I'm wondering that if you live far from your grandchildren, would you take that time when you're spending with them to go sit in a synagogue versus spending time with them at home and interacting, where you're not really interacting when you're at services? So I was just thinking that maybe the distance played a factor, and that's why more interaction is done at home, because if you live far from your grandchildren, you're going to use that time to be more engaged.
Here's how I would respond to that. And what we've been thinking about is, to take a step back and think about not so much the traditional activities we do on Shabbat and the prohibitions for Shabbat, but what are some of the essential messages or the essential elements of Shabbat? So, one essential element is kind of, let's say blessing your children. So I think what's worth thinking about is how grandparents can, rather than thinking about what are the traditional things we do on Shabbat, like going to shul, not that going to shul is a bad thing, but what are the first steps? It could be, we have a member of our board who has, I think she has 12 grandkids in 4 different time zones. And she lights Shabbos candles 4 times every Friday night. And she blesses her grandkids 4 different times every Friday night. We have one of our members of our community wrote a blog about how when they invite grandkids over to their house, they have one room that they make the Shabbat room. And there's no TV, there's no phones, but there are games. And so what they're doing is compartmentalizing different pieces of the Shabbat experience and making them more accessible. One of the things we talk about, one of the ways to start is my cousin Jeremy, who's an Orthodox rabbi, lives in Israel. He says the best way to start engaging and celebrating Shabbat is to get a tablecloth. Those simple acts where you make basic statements about the sacredness of Shabbat are the right ways to start from our perspective. And so it's exactly what you're saying. Think about getting together with your grandkids on Shabbat and what will make it Shabbat. And the message is, all right, no driving, no electronics. What are the core elements of Shabbat that are important to us? Let's take a hike, let's take a walk in the woods together and enjoy nature.
Right. I'm just thinking that if you're not Shabbat observant, then those things are, you're not going to be doing those things anyway. So, depending upon your sample, it impacts how somebody looks at that sort of thing. I wanted to ask you about surrogate grandparents. Like when you have grandchildren that live far from you and you're part of a synagogue and there are children there that may not have grandparents or may not have grandparents close by. Have you ever seen or do you know of like a grandparent project where they match families that need grandparents and grandparents that need grandchildren?
So there are organizations that do that, and we haven't really studied that or researched it. We know that
that was one of the things that Terry and I had talked about with the Principals Council, because there were a bunch of the principals at the religious schools who said that could be a great idea with being able to engage the grandparents in a way, the grandparents that were members of those synagogues who didn't necessarily have grandkids in the area.
Yeah, so there are organizations like Dorot that do things like that. I will say that we know that before COVID, less than half grandparents had used either Zoom or FaceTime or other kinds of video communication in the past year. Since COVID, we know that I think it's about 80% of grandparents are either doing FaceTime or Zoom with their grandkids 2-3 times a month. So, and we also asked grandparents how many of them had participated in any kind of Jewish life cycle, ceremony during COVID online, and 3/4 of them have. So I think there's an interesting opportunity, a new openness to use virtual communication to bring grandparents and grandkids together, even if they're far away. And that's what we've been trying to accomplish with the family room.
Mm-hmm. I think the website and the projects that you showed us is such a great resource, and we'll be sure to share all of that. And you said all of the slides that you showed us were also on your website?
Not the slides themselves, but there's a full page on our website devoted to the national study, and their detailed documentation about it. I want to say 2 things about the family room site. One is we welcome individuals to use it, but also our board has voted that any organization, any synagogue, any JCC who would like to post a family room on that website, we will work with you to do that. We will provide a turnkey solution where you could add these resources to your organization's website. Our investment is getting this out to as many grandparents as possible and to grow our network of grandparent community. We, by the way, have a wonderful Facebook group that now has about, I want to say 1,600 members, and they're very active and they're sharing nachas and tzuras and their stories and recipes. So anybody, any grandparent who would be interested should sign up. We also have fabulous monthly webinars, and all people need to do is sign up to receive a notification on our website. And so far, all of those webinars have been free to the public.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad that we were able to hear from you today, and you know, all the resources that we have available to our community. I truly want to thank you for giving us your time and for doing this presentation. We know that others will take advantage of it and watch it at another time.
Terrific. Well, my great pleasure. And I hope
Definitely.
All right. Take care,
Thank
everybody.
you so much. Have a
Right.
great night.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.